All right, this is Openstax US History, Chapter 9, Section 2, A Vibrant Capitalist Republic. So last section, we talked 9-1 about the Industrial Revolution and really how important that was. But it's also important to remember that this was mostly happening in the Northeast. For the rest of the country, there were different sort of transformations taking place. In the West, especially in the early 1800s and really all the way up into the Civil War, there was a huge amount of interest in Western land. Recall that after the American Revolutionary War, all land up to the Mississippi was granted to the United States. And then after Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States, there were many speculators who were looking to buy land, hoping that it would increase in value. So a speculator is someone who purchases. So in this case, we're talking about land, but you could be a speculator in anything, the stock market or various investments, whatever it means. But speculators are people who purchase, we'll just say things. I mean, you could probably call them assets or something, in anticipation that they will rise in value, right? So it's not necessarily that you have a use for that land right now. It's that by purchasing that land today, you're hoping that tomorrow it's going to be worth more, or a year from now, or 10 years from now, whatever it is. And this led to the really gobbling up of territory, specifically in the Ohio region. They called this Ohio fever. We might call this the quick decision to purchase Western land. Right, all these speculators were going out there and buying this land in hopes that it would rise in value. The United States set up land offices, so we might say these are institutions to oversee the selling of land. And really in this, not just on a purely economic kind of front, but really in a more cultural and social change, was this different perception of the West. You know, really in the colonial era, the West was considered to be, the wilderness. The West was considered to be backwards, not sort of as quote unquote developed as kind of the coastal elite or the coastal cities. Recall that in the colonial era, really much of United States commerce and even culture, for that matter, and even economy was tied to Europe. Everything was transatlantic. It went across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Really following the War of 1812, when the United States is cut off from Great Britain, the United States focuses a lot more inwards in some respects, and doing that means looking at the Western territories, not sort of as this backwoods where sort of the hillbillies live, but looking at towards, the frontier, right? We might just say, especially after 1812. And you really see this depicted in a lot of artwork at the time and culture. Again, the West is not just sort of this backwoods area, but it's a place to be explored. It's a place to conquer. It's tied up in even Christianity in some ways. And, developing it from wilderness to frontier becomes a major characteristic of American identity, really all the way up until the 1900s in some respects, the very early 1900s. But, it was also this very quick and hasty decision to just massively purchase Western land that ultimately contributed to the very first economic crisis, really, in the constitutional era. And that's the Panic of 1819. So we might just call this a major economic crisis. Now, like all economic crises, they're very complicated. There are a lot of contributing factors. But two factors, or at least, a couple things that we can say, this land fever or Ohio fever ultimately didn't pay off in terms of investments. And, banks sort of over issuing money. So we might say of banks, they gave out too many loans to purchase the land. Again, if someone's willing to take out a loan if the anticipation is that the land prices will go up, that of course ended up not occurring in this case. So there was almost too many loans that were out there, and ultimately they didn't yield back what was desired. In order to meet the demand for land fever, banks issued more and more paper money as opposed to specie. Specie is what we might call hard money, aka gold and silver. Gold and silver are good in the sense that you physically have the value there. One of the downsides to using a gold and silver based economy, though, is that it's very limited. And so, if there is money that is needed for economic investment, gold and silver really limit that ability to make those investments. But also, in the same time, it makes sure that poor investments aren't also made. In this case, banks began to issue out, or banks continued to issue out more and more and more paper money. And this ultimately led to this panic. Now, the United States did recognize this problem and issued another Bank of the United States in 1816. We might call this the Second National Bank. Remember, Alexander Hamilton created the first national bank. That actually expired under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, was opposed to Hamilton. But this second national bank was made to continue investments in the country, to make the nation a more active more active economically. Didn't really solve the problem too much, and when a lot of those investments went bankrupt, the Panic of 1819 occurred. One result there was the crashing of crop prices. Crops, of course, are very important because Americans produce crops. And one thing that we want to make the connection between is that crops are tied to land. So much of the land that was being purchased, the idea was that land could be used to grow crops like wheat. Once those prices went down, that meant that the land prices also went down. And again, people owed money on land that wasn't worth essentially what it should have been worth or what they had speculated it to be worth. Combined with paper money, this led to, again, an economic downturn. Congress did pass laws that tried to provide some relief. So just a few examples here: the Land Law and the Relief Act. We might call this congressional action to help those affected by the panic. And that helped provide some relief in the meantime. So we'll talk more about the Panic of 1819, because one of the things that it does, and this is, we'll talk about this in a different chapter, is it really begins to highlight a bigger difference between what we might call the common class and the elite classes, and starts to sow maybe a little bit of discontent between those two sides. Meanwhile, though, industrialization was taking place in the Northeast, and along with it came various innovations. I mean, so much so that the United States was called a laboratory of innovation. In a lot of ways, the U.S. led the world in various technological developments. It wasn't Europe, like, and really for all of colonial and American history. And perhaps the most important inventor at the time was Eli Whitney, who, amongst other things, invented the cotton gin. So, of course, Eli Whitney, he's an inventor. Cotton gin was a device that removed seeds from cotton quicker. Ironically, Eli Whitney hoped that the cotton gin would actually decrease the demand for slaves. Here you see image slaves using the cotton gin, this sort of device. I don't know really how well it can be seen, but if you're looking at it, here's the cotton, and you put it through this sort of wooden device here. You turn the crank, and by placing it through this device, the seeds come out rather than having to pick them out hand by hand. Whitney hoped that this device would actually decrease the number of slaves that were needed. In fact, it had the exact opposite effect, because now that the seeds of cotton could be removed essentially 50 times quicker, the demand for slaves increased by 50 times, not for removing the seeds, but for planting and harvesting the cotton. So it actually led to an increase in the number of slaves that were needed. Other things that Whitney invented, including machine tools. These were used to develop standardized and interchangeable parts. Really a brilliant invention by Whitney. Standardized or interchangeable parts were used for things like guns and clocks. I mean, so brilliant, it almost seems self-evident. This was simply just the idea that items or, goods should be made not as one singular unit, but as a series of various parts. So, for example, gun makers in those days would make a gun from start to finish. And, let's say if the barrel broke, then you would have to go back to the gun manufacturer and get the whole thing replaced. Whereas Whitney's brilliant invention was to instead make the parts all separate from one another, make them interchangeable. That way, if one part ends up breaking, you don't have to replace the whole gun. You can simply just replace the part that broke. And this was very important for things like factory machinery. You could imagine investing how many thousands of dollars into a factory, the huge type of machinery that was needed for, the steam engine and whatever it was. And if it broke, having to replace the whole factory, it simply wouldn't be workable. And so this was a way, again, to cut down costs, and pretty much was adopted in the production of everything. It's hard to imagine a world today in which we don't have interchangeable parts, and that was in part due to Whitney. Again, the machine tools were tools that created, the various things that were necessary for these products with interchangeable parts, factory equipment, guns, clocks. Those were the types of things that were made. So Whitney, probably the most important inventor of the time, but other very important inventions included Robert Fulton's invention of the steamship. It was just the idea of taking a steam engine, and putting it on a boat. Before, boats could only travel using, really water or wind power. But again, that was really constrained by the natural world. A great example would be the Mississippi River. It's not really an over-exaggeration to say something like, people only sailed down the Mississippi since the beginning of time. Now, when these ships were equipped with steam power, they could sail against the current. You can see here, this is a water wheel. The steam engine would be powering it. It would be able to travel. And of course, the smokestack of the burning coal that's coming off there. So every single internal river, or I guess all rivers are internal, but every single river was now a two-way street, as opposed to being a one-way street before. It also meant that, voyages across the Atlantic Ocean didn't require you to sit there and wait for the wind to blow you across the ocean. You could now simply just go across the ocean despite the current, despite the wind. It greatly cut down the cost of transportation. It greatly increased the speed at which people could travel, and really revolutionized not just, commerce, but just the way that people live. Fulton's invention of the steamship there made every single river a two-way street, essentially. And really, in the United States, this might be covered in another chapter, but really contributed to canal construction, which was man-made rivers. Other important inventions for American agriculture included the mechanical reaper, which you see pictured here. The idea is that you attach the mechanical reaper to a horse. I think the horse goes, no, I guess the horse would go, does it go in front or in back of it? I think it probably goes in front of it. That wouldn't make very much sense. And they pull this device, and it cuts the wheat, And this was a way of mass producing that as opposed to the way that it was done before. And that was just a person with a scythe, the thing that Grim Reapers carry. So that greatly increased the amount of food production. John Deere invented a better plow that was made out of steel. Again, that could more effectively be used for farming. This also maybe contributed some of the falling in agricultural prices because of the increase in production there. And lastly, when it came to communication, Samuel Morse helped develop the telegraph. The telegraph was a way to send communication over long distances, pretty much anywhere a telegraph wire existed, one could send a message using Morse code, which was a language or a communication method of, I think it's lines and dots. It would travel via electronic signal, and depending on what, dot line was some sort of letter, and you would string together a number of letters so that you could communicate over long distances. And this was the first time that people could communicate over long distances without having some sort of physical letter. Back in the Revolutionary era, it required the Continental Congress to literally write a letter, put it on a ship, send it over to England, and for that communication to get there physically. With telegraph wires, and a telegraph wire was put down across the Atlantic Ocean a lot later than this time period, after the Civil War. But now, England and the United States could communicate directly via this telegraph wire. And of course, these were placed inside the United States, only increased commercial activity. And all these things together, steamship, the Morse code, telegraph, they all kind of made the world a smaller place than it was before.